Mark, Emma, and Josh were a tight-knit group of friends, always chasing the thrill of exploration. They thrived on finding the weird, the abandoned, and the eerie. On their way back from a weekend road trip, their car broke down in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. With the sun setting, they had no choice but to seek shelter for the night. That's when they saw it, a looming structure on the horizon. It looked like an old circus warehouse, its faded colors barely visible under a gray, overcast sky. Better than sleeping in the car, Josh joked, though his voice wavered. They approached cautiously. The massive double doors creaked open, revealing a cavernous interior shrouded in darkness. Dust motes hung in the air, disturbed by their footsteps. Rusting carnival rides and shattered mirrors lined the walls. The remnants of laughter and joy seemed to cling to the place like a ghostly echo. As they explored, their flashlights illuminated something bizarre, a glass box in the center of the warehouse. Inside was a life-sized clown mannequin, dressed in tattered black and white mime garb. Its face was painted with a ghastly grin, and its eyes, too lifelike, seemed to gleam in the light. A plaque bolted to the box read, "Do not open." Emma shuddered. Why would anyone need to write that? Josh chuckled nervously. To keep idiots like us from messing with it. Mark, ever the skeptic, tapped on the glass. It's just a prop. Creepy, yeah, but harmless. They decided to camp in the far corner of the warehouse, as far from the glass box as possible. The night deepened, and the silence of the warehouse grew oppressive. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the broken windows. It was Emma who first noticed something was wrong. She woke with a start, her heart pounding. Across the room, the glass box stood empty. "Guys, where's the clown?" she whispered, shaking Mark and Josh awake. "What do you mean?" Mark grumbled, but then his eyes snapped to where the box was. Josh cursed under his breath. "Someone's messing with us." They searched the warehouse, their flashlights slicing through the dark. The clown was nowhere to be seen, until Emma spotted it. It stood at the far end of a corridor, frozen mid-pose, as if performing an invisible act. "That wasn't there before," Josh muttered. Mark stepped closer, shining his light on it. The clown's painted grin seemed wider now, its head tilted slightly to the side. "It's just a mannequin," he said, though his voice betrayed him. They backed away, retreating to their makeshift campsite. But sleep was impossible. Every sound, the groaning of the wind, the creak of old wood, set them on edge. By morning, Emma was gone. Mark and Josh searched frantically, calling her name. Their shouts echoed through the warehouse, but there was no response. Then they saw her. She was seated on a rusting Ferris wheel, her body slumped unnaturally. Her face was frozen in terror, her mouth wide open as if mid-scream. "No, no, no!" Mark yelled, rushing toward her. But as he approached, he stopped dead. Propped beside her was the clown, mimicking her scream with its painted grin. Josh grabbed Mark's arm. "We need to get out of here, now!" They sprinted for the doors, but the warehouse seemed to shift around them. Hallways stretched longer, looping back to the central chamber. No matter where they turned, the clown was there, always closer. When Josh vanished, Mark was left alone. His flashlight flickered, its beam catching glimpses of grotesque carnival props that seemed to leer at him. He stumbled into a room filled with dusty mannequins dressed in circus costumes. Among them, the clown stood, perfectly still. "Stay away!" Mark screamed, brandishing a broken pipe he'd found. The clown didn't move, until it did. Its movements were sudden, jerky, like a puppet on strings. Mark swung the pipe, shattering its porcelain-like face. Beneath the cracked surface was something far worse. Flesh, pale and writhing, with hollow black eyes that seemed to suck the light from the room. Mark ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The warehouse had become a maze, each turn bringing him back to the glass box. Now, it wasn't empty. Inside was Emma, her lifeless eyes staring out, her body twisted into a grotesque pose. The clown stood beside the box, raising a hand as if to wave goodbye. Days later, the warehouse stood silent again. Authorities found no trace of the friends, only the empty glass box and a new plaque. "Welcome to the show." In the quaint village of Willowstead, nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, 12-year-old Clara wandered the cobbled streets after school one chilly autumn afternoon. The air was thick with the scent of fallen leaves and the faint hum of villagers closing their shops for the evening. As she strolled, something unusual caught her eye. A small shop she had never seen before. The sign above the door read, "Eternal Companions, Dolls Made to Last Forever." Drawn by curiosity, Clara pushed open the creaky door. Inside, the shop was dimly lit, the scent of lavender and dust lingering in the air. Shelves lined the walls, each crammed with lifelike dolls of all shapes and sizes. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow her as she moved. "Good evening, child," came a voice, thin and wavering. From the shadows emerged an elderly woman dressed in a long, faded gown. Her hands, twisted with age, clasped a tiny porcelain doll. I didn't know this shop was here," Clara stammered. The woman chuckled. "Few do, but you were meant to find it." Clara's gaze landed on a doll resting on a shelf near the counter. It wore a pale blue dress with delicate lace, its hair a cascade of golden ringlets. Its expression was eerily serene, yet oddly captivating. "Ah, you have good taste," the woman crooned, following Clara's gaze. "This one is special, perfectly crafted, made to last forever." The price was surprisingly low, and despite a strange unease prickling at the back of her neck, Clara bought the doll. She carried it home in a paper bag, unaware of the storm she had unleashed. That night, Clara placed the doll on her dresser before climbing into bed. As she lay under her quilt, a strange sensation washed over her, as though she were being watched. The doll sat silently, its painted lips curved in a faint smile. By morning, Clara was sure the doll had moved. Its head, which had been tilted slightly to the left, now faced straight ahead. She convinced herself she was imagining things, but as the days passed, the oddities grew. The doll's expression seemed to shift, mirroring Clara's moods. When she was happy, its smile widened. When she was upset, its delicate brows knitted ever so slightly. The night she saw it blink, Clara screamed. Her mother rushed in, finding her trembling and pointing at the doll. "It moved, Mom! It's alive!" Her mother sighed, patting her head. "It's just a doll, Clara. You're letting your imagination run wild." But Clara knew what she saw. Determined to understand what was happening, Clara returned to the shop the next day. The bell above the door tinkled as she entered, but the shop was eerily silent. Shelves that had been brimming with dolls were now empty. The old woman appeared from the back, her face a mask of unsettling calm. "Back so soon?" she asked. "There's something wrong with the doll," Clara said, her voice shaking. "It's alive." The woman's lips curled into a crooked smile. "They're not alive, dear. They're merely vessels. For souls." Clara's heart sank. "What do you mean?" The woman motioned to a nearby chair, but Clara stayed rooted. The woman sighed and explained, "Each doll is a sanctuary, a prison for those who've wronged me. Children who mocked, stole, or disobeyed, but they're restless, you see. They long to be free, and sometimes they find someone to take their place." Clara's blood ran cold. "Take their place?" The woman stepped closer, her shadow stretching unnaturally across the floor. "They can only leave if someone else takes their spot. You chose the doll, Clara. It chose you back." Panicked, Clara fled the shop, but the woman's words echoed in her mind. That night, the doll's movements became undeniable. It turned its head to watch her, its eyes glittering with malice. Then, Clara felt it, her limbs growing heavy, her movements sluggish. The doll, sitting on her desk, now had a faint flush to its porcelain cheeks, as though it was becoming more human. Clara tried to destroy it, grabbing a hammer from the garage. She swung at the doll, but the hammer ricocheted off its body, as though it were made of steel. "Why are you doing this?" Clara screamed. The doll tilted its head, its painted lips parting. A faint, childlike whisper filled the room. "Let me go." Over the next few days, Clara's body began to change. Her skin grew stiff and pale. Her joints ached and she struggled to move. Meanwhile, the doll grew more lifelike, its hair softening, its eyes brightening. Desperate, Clara returned to the shop, but it was gone. The building stood empty, its windows boarded up. Back home, she confronted the doll one last time. "What do you want from me?" The doll's lips curled into a smile, and it whispered, "To live." When Clara's mother entered her room the next morning, she found a new doll sitting on the desk, dressed in Clara's favorite pajamas. Its painted eyes sparkled, and its expression was hauntingly familiar. Downstairs, the front door creaked open. A young girl's voice called out, "Good morning, Mom." A group of 4 friends, Mark, Olivia, Ethan, and Sophie, embarked on a hiking trip into the remote wilderness. The trail was rugged and rarely traveled, offering the seclusion they craved. It was meant to be an escape from their routines, a weekend to reconnect with nature and each other. Late in the afternoon of their first day, they stumbled upon something odd, a lone, weathered tent pitched in a small clearing. The tent looked abandoned, its fabric faded and torn in places. Curious but uneasy, they approached it cautiously. A strange chill hung in the air despite the warm autumn sun. Mark, always the bravest, or the most reckless, was the first to unzip the tent flap. Inside, they found a bizarre sight. The interior was covered in strange, cryptic symbols drawn in a dark, crusty substance that looked disturbingly like dried blood. The symbols spiraled and twisted, forming patterns that made their eyes ache to look at. A small collection of items, animal bones, melted candles, and a shattered compass, were arranged in ritualistic circles on the floor. "Someone was into some weird stuff," Ethan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's just go," Sophie urged, her stomach churning with unease. But Mark snapped a few photos, joking about sharing the cursed tent on social media. As dusk fell, they moved on, setting up their own camp a mile or so away. They laughed off the eerie discovery over dinner, but the unease lingered like the smoky scent of their campfire. That night, the first nightmares came. Mark dreamt of running through the woods, pursued by something unseen, but unbearably close. Olivia found herself trapped in an endless maze of trees, hearing whispers in a language she couldn't understand. Ethan dreamt of being suffocated by vines that grew tighter the more he struggled. Sophie, the lightest sleeper, woke up gasping, her dream too fragmented to remember, but leaving her drenched in cold sweat. When morning came, they hesitated to share their dreams, afraid of seeming childish. But as they packed up, they all felt a mounting tension in the air. By mid-afternoon, they realized they were lost. The trail seemed to twist and vanish, leaving them wandering in circles. Then they saw it, the same tent from the day before, sitting ominously in a clearing. "But we left it miles back," Olivia said, her voice trembling. Mark inspected it again and his stomach dropped. The symbols inside had changed. Among the spiraling lines, there were now crude but unmistakable drawings of 4 human figures. They were positioned around the tent as if watching it, or being watched. "We need to leave. Now," Sophie insisted. But no matter which direction they chose, they always ended up back at the cursed tent. As night fell, they had no choice but to camp near it. The second night was worse. Their dreams became indistinguishable from reality. Twigs snapped outside their tents, and shadows flitted just beyond the firelight. Olivia swore she saw figures moving between the trees, but when Ethan checked, there was nothing there. Around midnight, Sophie woke up screaming. Her tent was covered in the same symbols as the cursed one, pulsating faintly as if alive. When they checked their own tents, they were horrified to find they had all transformed. Each was now an exact replica of the cursed tent, symbols and all. Their belongings were gone, replaced by the ritualistic objects they'd seen before. Panicked, they decided to abandon the campsite entirely, running blindly into the woods. But the forest seemed alive, the trees twisting unnaturally, their branches clawing at the group. The air grew colder, and the shadows deepened, swallowing their flashlight beams. Ethan was the first to disappear. One moment he was running beside Olivia, the next he was gone, his scream echoing faintly through the woods. Mark and Sophie clutched each other, but when they turned to find Olivia, she too had vanished. Mark and Sophie stumbled back into the clearing, exhausted and terrified. The cursed tent was there, waiting. Its flap was open, inviting. "We have to destroy it," Mark said, grabbing a fallen branch and lighting it on fire. As he approached the tent, the symbols began to writhe, their lines shifting and coiling like living snakes. The fire in his hand flickered and died, leaving them in suffocating darkness. Suddenly, Sophie screamed. Something had grabbed her, dragging her into the trees. Mark turned to help, but his legs were paralyzed. Invisible forces gripped him, pulling him toward the tent. He struggled, screamed, but it was no use. The last thing he saw before being swallowed by the darkness was the symbols on the tent, glowing with a malevolent light, and the faint outline of figures watching from the shadows. Weeks later, a search party found the clearing. There was no sign of the group, only 4 tents arranged in a circle. Each was covered in strange symbols, and inside each tent was a crude figure made of sticks and bones, dressed in the missing hiker's clothes. The search party left quickly, vowing never to speak of what they saw. But locals say the cursed tent still appears to those who wander too deep into the forest, waiting for its next victims.